Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Clean Libertarian Podcast. I hope everybody is having a phenomenal week. I am so sorry that this got out late. Spike Cohen is the guest today, all right? And he's sharing his story of recovery. And Spike is a very, very busy man. And I am also busy in my own way, with work schedule and stuff like that. So we got our wires crossed a little bit, and he was gracious enough to meet up with me on a Monday. So this is getting out a day late, but trust me, it was well worth the wait. This is an awesome interview of recovery, and just hearing Spike's story. Not a lot of people have heard that. And so without any further ado, here is Spike Cohen. All right, and I am here with the one, the only Mr. Spike Cohen. Spike, thank you so much for showing up. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, Drew. Thanks for having me on, man.
Hey, anytime, man. This is something I've been looking forward to for a while. So for everybody out there, if you don't know who Spike Cohen is, he is the 2020 vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party. And you're kind of a globetrotter now, right? You're going around. What is it that you do nowadays?
So now what I'm doing is pretty much every weekend I'm in a different part of the country, either attending or speaking at a libertarian convention or event, or going and taking part in charity and mutual aid and outreach events, which is what I did this past weekend actually throughout Tennessee, in Murfreesboro and Cookeville and Knox County and a few other places in Tennessee. Or going to specific events to meet people. Pretty much the main thread of everything that I'm doing is going around the country to help spread liberty and to get libertarians and liberty-oriented people excited about the idea of spreading our message and of getting involved in our communities and in taking back our communities from out of control, powerful people who are using that power to impose their will upon us and rob us blind as a result of it. It has been it's been incredibly rewarding this year being able to go around the country and do that.
I can imagine it would be, man. What would you say you've learned in the process of this? Have you picked up on anything new, or are you just kind of honing some stuff you already had going?
You know what? I think the biggest thing that has surprised me is I always have theorized that our ideas catch on when we're able to share them with people and when we actually get out into our communities and talk with people about them. I think I have been surprised with how easily it can spread. And I think in retrospect, I shouldn't have been surprised, because when you're with a group of people who are excited and engaged and involved and care about their communities, that shows and it reflects in what it is you're doing, and it attracts other people. So even if they aren't going to 100% buy into every single libertarian idea, they at least can recognize right off the bat that we're there to do good, that we're there to help, that we're there to fix problems, and everything that comes forward from what we say and do, it's already going to be received that much more agreeably than we would have even thought. It's been an incredible thing. Again, this past weekend, we were in downtown Murfreesboro, Tennessee. We took part in actually providing food. We put together breakfast and care packages that had things like hygiene products and feminine hygiene products and tarps, or not tarps. That's the word I'm looking for. Ponchos and actually it did have tarps in it as well, because they've been having a lot of rain there. For homeless people that right now, thanks to the regulations and NIMBY laws that are in a lot of these cities, it has forced the homeless people to go live out in the woods. The homeless shelters were shut down because of regulations, a lot of it due to COVID, and now as a result, they're living in the woods. They're living in these camps with some of these cities have thousands of people living in camps out in the woods. And we went out there with food and care packages. And we were inviting other members of the community. We were highlighting what it was that was happening to these poor folks and encouraging them to come out and join us. So the people there already knew what we were doing. And then when we were done doing that, as rewarding and incredible as that was, it was almost as rewarding and incredible to talk to everyday people that were walking around downtown Murfreesboro and other places in Tennessee, and telling them about what we were doing, telling them about the problems that are going on there in that community and in the state, and giving them our solutions for how we can fix these things. And very, very well received across the board. Certainly not every single person said, "Oh, wow, I think I'm a libertarian now," but far greater numbers than one would have expected.
And that fires me up to hear that. So often when we do stuff, outreach events and things like that, we can kind of not see the long-term effects, but somebody who is doing it on a consistent basis, and hearing that, our ideas are catching on. Man, I love hearing that, Spike. And I just, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for everything that you do.
Oh, I'm happy to do it, man. I'll tell you something. It has been, a lot of times I'll have people and they're thanking me, and I'm grateful that I can do it. But I'll tell you something. It has been healing for me to be able to be invited and sent out to all these different places across the country, meeting libertarians across the country. In just the past month, I have been to Tennessee, Wisconsin. Gosh, where else? This is how often. Ohio, and Alaska, and what was it? Oklahoma City. Well, it's to see you guys. So in just the past, just over a month, I've been to all these different states. The previous weekend, I was in Ohio. We were helping push a constitutional amendment to be put on the ballot for the Ohio voters to vote on that would end qualified immunity. And the Libertarian Party there has built a coalition with a bunch of other groups that aren't libertarian groups, but we all agree with the need to end qualified immunity. And in building that coalition, people like Kevin Kahn and Chrissy Wickers have built these incredible relationships with non-libertarian people who are also very excited about their activism. And we're coming up with other things that we can have coalitions on. And they're all things that we already agree on. And we're just, maximizing and leveraging the ability to work with others. And to get to see that in person is just, it is, I can't put into words how grateful I am, and how, again, healing is the only word I can think of. It is a nourishment for the soul and the spirit to see these things in person over and over again across the country.
It's a beautiful thing, man. Well, and here's another way that I'm looking forward to you giving back, because, the whole reason I brought you on was to share your story of recovery. Like that's what I really wanted to hear from you. And so just gonna ham fist it like that. I don't know how else to softball it in there, man. So why don't you tell us, Spike, how did you come to find some freedom, and what was that like for you?
Well, I think it's probably best to start with why I was even involved in addiction in the first place. And, I started very, very young. I was like about 13 years old when I first started getting into drugs. And I actually started with smoking and alcohol. They say that weed's the gateway drug. I don't believe in gateway drugs, and there's no data to support it. But in my case, the first thing I used was alcohol. I can't really say it was a gateway drug, because honestly, that was just what I was able to get my hands on first. And I was bound and determined to try to take everything I possibly could. And I'm right here. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Now you're back.
Okay, well, I closed out the browser, but you should be able to hear me. What was the last thing you heard?
Don't give me a line. You going to start the 13 thing again?
Okay.
I'm sorry, buddy.
No problem.
I was following along, then I was just like, oh my God, is that me or is that you? Okay.
Yeah. So I'll just leave the browser up, because that shouldn't affect it. But okay. I started very young, around 13, and in retrospect, I started very with alcohol and with smoking. That was my first drugs that I used. I don't believe in gateway drugs, but and there's no data to support the gateway drug theory. But if there was a quote unquote gateway drug, it was actually alcohol and cigarettes. But the reality is, I just started with alcohol first and cigarettes first, because they were the easiest thing to get a hold of at the time. I was bound and determined to take whatever drug I could. So it quickly led on to other things as well. And in retrospect, I think that the reason that I got involved in drugs so early was a combination of things. I think first of all, coming out of homeschooling and going into public schooling, um, it was I was not getting a good educational experience, and I didn't feel relatable to the other kids that were in the public schools, at least initially. But when I started doing drugs, then I thought, oh, doing drugs made me cool. But really, what happened was doing drugs just made me relatable to other people who did drugs. So it wasn't that I became cool; it just became a common point with other kids that were doing drugs.
Yeah.
And then I think that another aspect to that was also some trauma and pain from parents divorce and stuff like that, and not really being able to resolve that, kind of being thrust into school and stuff, kind of led me down that path. um Fast forward a few years later, I was convinced that I was doing well, and the reason for that is because I actually started a business when I was 16, and I was pretty good at it and became pretty successful. So that by the time I was in my early mid 20s, I was very, very successful. I don't know anyone my age. I didn't know anyone personally at my age that was doing anywhere near as well as I was financially. And that allowed me to convince myself that I was doing well in all aspects of my life. But I actually wasn't. I was a mess in most other aspects of my life. And a lot of that had to do with my addiction. And there were I'm not really it's hard to think of the exact thing that led me to give up on doing drugs, and to start that process. But I think honestly a big part of it was just feeling like I had hit a ceiling. Like there wasn't anything more I was going to be able to do while constantly being high. Um, and at this point, I'm doing all sorts of different stuff, and lots of it, sort of all the time. And in I think that began the process of me kind of examining why I was even doing it in the first place, if I was even enjoying it, or whether I was, truly doing it because I was addicted. I think I'd kind of convinced myself I wasn't an addict, I was just enjoying it.
Right.
And when that happened, when I started doing that, I had a really quick kind of light bulb moment, at least for the hard stuff. I kind of stuck to quote unquote recreationally, or I guess socially, using alcohol for a little bit after that, until I realized that was going to be a problem too, to try to keep using, even though alcohol was never really my real hard drug to get off of. But that started around, and I hate that I don't remember the exact date, but it was kind of around this time, in 2006. So now I've been sober for roughly 15 years now.
Beautiful, man. And I want to kind of circle back to a point that you mentioned, is that, you talked about finding your crowd whenever you started kind of using, but it was
Yes.
because it made you more relatable. Like,
Yeah.
break that down for us a little bit, because I know what you're talking about, but for those who may not.
So and relatable is the wrong word. I think it just gave me something to talk about or do with this, group of kids that were also doing it.
Right.
But so I was homeschooled off and on. I was very what's the word? I always feel weird saying this. Like I was very intelligent, but I was, one of these gifted kids, and I would even go to a camp during the summer for gifted kids, and I would, ace tests that they would give me, and when I was in school, or even when I was being homeschooled, and I was always at the top of, the high performance level for any kind of testing or any kind of classes or any kind of acceleration or anything like that. Coming into middle school, after my parents got divorced and they weren't able to homeschool me anymore, um, going into public school, I went from being this really, really smart kid, that everyone was, fawning over for being so brilliant, to being this kid that really didn't know much of the popular stuff, wasn't really into the same things that the other kids were. And I dealt with some bullying. It was never, I in retrospect, I used to say, I dealt with a lot of bullying, but then I'll hear the stories that other people go through that were just, heartbreaking to hear their stories. But I went through some bullying, more than anything. I just went through not, really being relatable, or not really knowing what to talk about with other kids, not really knowing what to do with other kids. And I think that, coupled with just some of the trauma related to the divorce. My parents' divorce was actually not that bad, and they're actually good friends now, and they were always good parents to me. So there was nothing, any kind of abuse or anything like that. But they were also my everything. I was homeschooled, and I was kind of in an insular situation, and having that breakup happen was pretty tough. And so coming into, sixth, seventh grade, it was really difficult, like not feeling like I had anyone that I really related to, and not feeling like there was really anyone I could even talk to about it. And so coming into, seventh, eighth grade, I started doing drugs. I started drinking, started smoking cigarettes, and I thought, well, maybe that'll make me cool. And it didn't make me cool, and it presented all sorts of other issues. But what it also did was other kids who did that stuff, I now had something to talk about and do with them. So basically, I had people to go and drink with and smoke cigarettes with, and we could pretend together that we were all cool. Then that, eventually we were also smoking weed, and eventually we were also doing some other stuff as well. And part of the problem was I was able to remain in accelerated classes during this time because I still tested very well, and I didn't really have to pay attention. Going into school, I was actually about 2 or 3 grades behind what I'd already learned in homeschooling. So it allowed me to just kind of, going into freshman year, and they're still covering stuff I covered in, fifth grade in homeschooling. I was able to, think, oh, I can just do this and everything will be fine. And eventually, between the drug use and the fact that they did eventually start teaching stuff I didn't know, I reached a point where I wasn't able to keep up anymore. My grades started falling behind, and I started having a lack of interest. And also then when my business actually started doing kind of well, I completely stopped caring about schooling and just went completely into, what I thought was being an adult, which was having a business and doing drugs. And, but it gave kind of going back to your question about relatability, it just gave a common point of something that I was doing with other kids that I think, ultimately I am responsible for the fact that I chose to do drugs. I knew what I was doing. I knew that they weren't a good idea. I knew what they would potentially lead to. I wasn't, some poor kid who was going into this with no idea of what it was going to be like or anything like that. But I will say that I think that if, the school that I had gone into had been more engaging and hadn't been so, based on standardized testing and just being kind of a boring thing that I had to endure for 8 hours a day or whatever, I think that would have probably led to my being less likely to get involved in that if they'd had more things that had actually been engaging to me. If you weren't into sports, there really wasn't much else that the school had going on. And I wasn't into sports, so, I didn't have anything much else for me to get interested in. So there were a lot of layers there, but, taking personal accountability, even as a kid, I really did it because I hoped that it would kind of soothe some of the anxieties I was having, and also to give me something that would, again, using my thought process back then, quote unquote, make me cooler. But really, it was just give me something that I could do with these kids, these other kids, and mission accomplished on both of those, of course. But
right.
to obviously a lot of harm as a result of it.
Right. Well, the reason I wanted you to go back around to that is because like that, I feel like I've talked to a lot of people, I did the recovery thing. As I talked to a lot of people who have gotten clean, and almost all of us have the same story that for a portion in our lives, at least, it was like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It's just like we never fit in quite where we stood.
Yep.
And one of the interesting things is that I can say for me personally, like drugs were my undoing. However, drugs were also the main reason why I have any social understanding today. Like that was a avenue, it was whenever you said relatability, I got that. I understood that because, like that's where I was. I couldn't communicate with others effectively, but partying and doing all of that, it's kind of like that was my ticket into the social sphere.
So it's almost like an icebreaker, right? Like it's like,
yeah.
Hey, do you smoke? Hey, do you do this? Hey, do you do that? And if they say no, you're like, all right. And you get to walk away like, oh, they're not cool like me. They don't do drugs. But if someone does say, yes, I do that, you're like, awesome. Now I have, did we just become best friends? Like, it's like this instant, like, oh, you're addicted to this thing too? Sure. Great. Now we're friends. Like, And
Yeah.
it is a very interesting thing. Like it's and an odd kind of a I guess a side note there is when I stopped getting into, when I stopped doing drugs, and when I got, as a result of that, that kind of went from whatever time was being spent on drugs now got completely thrown into business. So that fast forward about a year and a half later, when I meet my now wife, when I meet my at the time girlfriend, and realize like, wow, I don't really have a lot of friends, and I didn't care because I was successful and I had a very robust business, and I had a growing online presence, and stuff that I was doing activism wise. Back then it was all neocon stuff. It's kind of embarrassing, but I had the semblance of what I pretended was a social life, but it was really like, I was just very, very deep in business and had my connections with people I was involved with in my business. But I didn't really have friends, or at least not a lot of them. And meeting my wife, who had a ton of friends and really lifelong deep friends, I'm like, yeah, no, I didn't have that. I had people I used to do drugs with that I don't really talk much to anymore. And what was cool was meeting her, and we started doing actual like healthy social things that you can do with people that don't involve heavy drinking and drugs. And so, getting into like salsa dancing and stuff. And now I have all these and to this day, and we still do the dancing, but we have these really long lasting friendships with people we've met in that scene. And, some of them drink, some of them do drugs, some of them get high or whatever, but that's not our common thread. And because we've met each other outside of those social circles, or outside of the initial reason for us getting together as well, we now have these really cool relationships. In fact, the weekend before last, before I flew to Columbus, I went to a wedding in Charleston, South Carolina, which is a wedding of two friends that we have from the salsa scene. So, but you're right. I mean, when you don't know how to relate to people, you can trick yourself into thinking this is a great way to make friends, but it's not. It's a great way to do drugs with people and pretend that they're your friends, and
Right.
it's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. And, it is a lot of those relationships we develop are very superficial. We've talked briefly whenever you were here in Oklahoma City about some of our using experiences, but
Yeah.
I think you understand what I mean by that. Like, it seemed like in the moment, especially when you're loaded, it's really easy to sit there and think, man, this is my best friend forever. But, when the dope's
Yes.
gone or whatever else, it's like,
Yep. Yep.
it's, or the sun comes up, God forbid, it's like, oh, it's a new day. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, but that's a valuable point that you're making there, is that, whenever you develop these relationships that aren't based upon the substance, it tends to be a lot more healthy. Who would have thought, right?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I remember in my teens and early 20s, I've got these friends, and we're getting high and we're sitting around and we're the best friends ever, and we're talking about what God knows what we're talking about. We thought it was deep. We're like, oh, we're having these great deep conversations. Who knows? I mean, I'd love to have recordings of that, because we're probably talking about complete and utter nonsense. But maybe it was. Who knows? Maybe it was we were solving the world's problems. But whatever it was, once we were coming down, and there was no solving the world's problems anymore. We were now just trying to get more weed, or get more whatever, like get more drugs. And it's funny how those people that were your best friend, now you're freaking going at each other's throats because you're angry that you can't find drugs in that moment, and you're taking it out on the person nearest to you. So you go from best friends to bitter enemies, and meanwhile
Yeah.
nothing actually changed other than the lubricant that you had been using to even be around these people in the first place, which was the drugs. And it's weird because I'm now friends with some of these people, and they're now clean as well, and they it's incredible to think back and be like, yeah, we went from best friends to worst enemies pretty damn quick. And it seems like the common thread there was whether or not we had any drugs there. So
Yep.
it's a really weird thing. But then that's it goes to show that at least at that time, yes, they may have been your friends, and you may have considered yourselves friends and all of that, but what you were all doing was a combination of trying to heal some kind of trauma or fill some kind of hole or gap in your life, and find something that you can relate to other people with, or some combination of those things. And when that drug goes away, all that stuff comes back. And now you're dealing with whatever, physical manifestation of addiction, the withdrawals or whatever as well. But honestly, bigger than that, at least for me, was just the realization of like, oh yeah, all that's still there. All that
Yeah.
trauma is still there. All that, who am I, and am I even all your self worth and self-esteem issues, all your existential dread, everything that was there before is still there now. And now your body's saying, I need some drugs. So it's an unfortunate thing, but it's really great to get to be able to talk to people who know what that's like and are on the other side of that, because now you can really value. It's not to say you can't value those things not having done that, but I can tell you, you and I, we certainly can value what an actual friendship is like and what
Oh
actual
yeah.
peace and happiness feels like.
Yeah, man, not knowing that there's not an angle somebody's using, with me,
Yes.
like that
Yep.
alone is just,
Yes.
there's a lot to that,
Yep.
and until you've experienced just a flood, like literally everybody around you constantly having an angle and having some freedom from that, man, it's pretty nice.
Yeah.
It's pretty
Yeah.
nice. And
Yep.
and it's like you were saying though, is like, once the drugs run out, then you have not only the problems that you had before, but then you also have the debilitating, just raw, unfiltered reality just seeping in. Like when I talk about the sun rising, what I mean is like you stayed up all night. And for
Yep.
me, seeing the sun come up was like, oh shit, the party's over. You know what I mean? Like it
Right.
was it was the worst part of my day every day, and it was it whenever I had that crushing realization that all I didn't fast forward through a bad part of my life. I just hit the pause button. You
Yep.
know what I
Yep.
mean? Like
Yep. 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 Yep.
that's what made it so bad, just knowing that like I'm still not dealing with this stuff. Now you kind of briefly touched on it, but like, what was it? What were you going through? What was the point where you were like, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Can you
I,
recall that?
yeah. Like I said, I really think one of the uh, uh, one of the downsides to being really, really, really high all the time is you don't necessarily remember everything very well in that moment. But I believe, looking back, I think the biggest thing, I know one of the big things, and I believe the biggest thing was simply I had hit a wall. I couldn't do
Mm,
any more work. I couldn't accomplish any more. I couldn't keep track of things any more than I already was until I was clean. And I knew it. I knew because I had already started reaching a point. It was interesting. I had started kind of not necessarily weaning off, but sort of bringing down the levels of drugs that I was using and the numbers of drugs that I was using, and had been kind of slowly doing that over time, with the idea that, well, if I'm just basically, smoking weed and drinking sometimes, or smoking weed all the time and drinking sometimes, and I stopped smoking cigarettes because those are bad for you, true. I stopped doing that and I stopped doing some of the harder stuff, then I should be okay. Maybe because again, in the back of my head, I always know drugs are bad. Like you shouldn't do drugs. Like drugs aren't good for you. They aren't healthy. They're I knew all of that stuff. But I also was like, well, if I just get rid of some of that unhealthy, the harder stuff, then I should be okay. But as I was doing that, I think I started to have some clarity of, well, actually, maybe I don't really need any of this, or at least I don't need to do it the way that I'm doing it. And this is where I really credit the fact that I had an incredibly supportive family and loved ones that were closest to me, that loved me no matter what and supported and accepted me no matter what. I also had the benefit, and I hate to say this, but I had the benefit of being successful, and the fact that because I wasn't poor, I wasn't worrying about like legal troubles and things like that. And so I was able to, when I talked to a lot of other addicts, unfortunately, their situation's a lot worse. By the time they're realizing that something needs to change, they're in a bad situation economically, financially. They're in a bad situation with their family and their loved ones. They're hitting rock bottom. They're having legal troubles, because they aren't in a position of being able to defend themselves from a legal thing. Mine was, I was in a situation where I was able to really kind of take a step back and say, do I want to keep doing this and sort of remain in this sort of morass, or this plateau that I've hit in terms of my personal success, or do I want to move forward and actually be more successful? And I chose the latter. And that actually goes back to what we've seen with studies with mice and other animals. They've done studies on drug addiction that when if you take two different groups of rats or mice or other types of animals, and you put one in one group of well, you put them all in a situation where anytime they want to, they can get some of a drug. They can press something and get some of a drug, either cocaine or meth or whatever. They can get a drug. But one of those groups, they're all isolated or in very small groups. And then in the other group of mice, they're able to freely interact with all the other mice that are in this control or in this study. The ones that are isolated or in very small groups are much more likely to remain addicted, because it's the only thing that they have. So in theory, unless they hit their little mouse rock bottom, whatever that is, they're just going to remain using that stuff until they die. Whereas the ones that have other things to look forward to and to live for actually eventually give up the drug. They stop using it. They might use it a few times and then decide they don't want it. I was sort of that other mouse that had those other things to look forward to, and I kind of gave it up because of that. I'm a very, very fortunate exception that most are not, who are in our situation where I didn't really have a rock bottom. I just realized that this wasn't what I wanted, and there was so much more to live for. And the cleaner I got and the less addicted I got, the less I wanted to do it. I originally resolved myself to just smoke pot occasionally. And then I stopped for a little while, smoked it a week or so later, and thought, I don't really like this. I don't like how this makes me feel. I feel way better. I don't, my sweat doesn't smell like weed, and I don't, I actually have energy when I wake up, and I don't think about, how much coffee I have to drink to be able to get out and do anything today. I actually felt better. And it's a real blessing. And that's why I have such a heart for this community of people that are trying to get clean, because my situation is one of the more graceful versions of this. And I mean, Drew, I don't have to tell you what it's like for most addicts that are going clean. And, it is, if we can be there for each other through these types of things, especially for those who are having it the hardest, what a blessing that is for them.
It's just, and regardless of how somebody found their freedom, whether it was a little bit at a time, somebody from a suitable situation like you came from, or somebody who was flat on their face, regardless of what brought them there, the fact that any of us find a way out and find a way to live without having to constantly put our lens through a filter of some narcotic or some substance, that's the whole epitome of why this podcast exists. Getting that message out there that there's life after the dope sack. You know what I mean? Like that.
Absolutely.
And a fulfilling life at that, a even more fulfilling life than we ever imagined, while we were out there. So that's, man, I'm just stoked to have you on to say that, alone, because that's a beautiful thing, Spike. I mean, that promise alone is a promise that nobody could ever give us before, like that's a huge, huge implication right there. And it's awesome.
It is. And I'll tell you something, Drew. It's why, I lit up when you talked about doing the sober caucus. I lit up, like my mind lit up. I didn't mean I lit up. But I was very, that would have been counterintuitive. No, I got very excited when you talked about having a sober caucus, and some people were like, oh, why do we need yet another caucus? I'm like, no, you guys don't get it. I knew it before you even told me what you wanted to do with it. I knew what you wanted to do with it, because there's many reasons why we need something like this. I've talked to people who have said that they don't go to libertarian events because there's a lot of drug use that happens at them. There's a lot of drinking that happens at them. And in fact, it's not just libertarian events. They avoid a lot of social events in general just because there's a lot of drinking. People like to party and hang out and whatever. And that's great. There are people who are able to do that stuff recreationally and still be able to, lead fulfilling and functional lives. And there are some people that are in addiction and just aren't ready to take that leap into sobriety yet. And that's perfectly fine. But for those who still are triggered by being around that kind of stuff, they intentionally stay away from it. And I respect their decision to do that. And I'm actually proud of them for, making that conscious choice to do them. But at the same time, I'm sad for them because they miss out on that. I'm someone that doesn't have, I'm not triggered by being around people doing that, which is good because I'm in a lot of libertarian events. And, people are, you know it, man. Like there's people and they're vaping, they're THC vaping, and you can smell it, or they're smoking, smoking weed, or they're drinking, or they're doing whatever. And it, and you can see it, and you can often smell it. And for me, that doesn't bother me. Each night this past weekend that I was in Tennessee, we would, go out to these bars and hang out. Last night I was at a pool bar, and we had a fun time. And some of the people that were drinking, that didn't bother me. But for a lot of libertarians, that does. For a lot of people in general that are fighting their addiction and recovering from it, that is a trigger. So what a cool thing to be able to have people who identify as, hey, listen, we're sober. We can be an accountability partner. We're someone you can hang out with, even either just us hanging out, or we can hang out with others that are doing those things. But as long as you're comfortable just being around us, then you don't have to worry about that. And we can have a fun time together without doing that kind of stuff. Yeah. I think it's really great to have that. And there's also, it also counter signals this narrative that so many people have. And this is really a far second reason for this. I mean, it's a good thing, but obviously the most important thing is what we're talking about right now is being able to help people who either want to get sober or who are remaining sober, trying to remain sober, to have that combination of support and accountability and camaraderie. But another benefit is there is this narrative that, well, libertarians just want to get high, and that's why they want to end the war on drugs, because they want to get high. And that's all it's about. If you're looking at it, all they're doing is getting high. And it's not hard for them to point at libertarians that are high. Now, let's be clear. It's not hard to point at anyone getting high. I mean, if I want to look for Republicans smoking weed or doing cocaine, or Democrats smoking weed or drinking too much or whatever, it is not going to be hard to you don't have to throw many stones to find that, right? But if that's the narrative that, well, libertarians only care about getting high, and then they can point at libertarians that are getting high, they can say, see, look, that's everything I needed to prove it. That's why I love being able to say to people when I talk about ending the war on drugs, I'm like, listen, I'll never do another drug again. I don't drink. I don't even drink coffee. Okay. I don't do anything. I don't take green tea pills. Like, I don't do anything. Right. Like I literally, the reason I want to end the war on drugs is because I want to kill the cartels, and I want to kill the corruption in government that it creates. And I want to heal that rift that goes between the government and the people that it supposedly serves, when it's constantly just putting people in cages for victimless crimes like that. I want to be able to allow addicts to get help without having to risk jail time for admitting that they're taking something. I just posted about these drug-free zone laws, and how, if you live near a municipal building or a school or a park, which means more than likely if you live in a poorer neighborhood, you're going to get if you're in a drug-free zone, you're going to get a 10 or 15 or 20-year minimum sentence for the same possession charge that someone living in the same neighborhoods that these lawmakers live in would get probation for or parole for, even if it's a first offense, because of these ridiculous mandatory minimum sentencing. Now, me as someone who is not only sober, but who is intentionally sober, and who can tell you how much I think drugs are harmful to a lot of people, we're in a very special position to be able to say, listen, we still want to end the war on drugs because it's bad, and not because we want to get high. And to have a caucus or an organization that is, positioning itself in that way, it is a very powerful antidote to that narrative. And it actually forces them to look at why a bunch of people who, some of us are still struggling every day to remain sober, and some of us have thankfully gotten past that to where we're just choosing to remain sober, and very happy that we did so. Even despite the fact that we are sober and intentionally so, we still want to end these things, and we are not just about making those legal so we can get high. It destroys their narrative, and it forces them to look at ours.
And that's the biggest nod I could ever get. But I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head, man. Like, that's the whole driving force behind it. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to telling an addict just don't ever use again. It's like telling a homeless person just go buy a house. There's a lot of nuance to be found in between point A and point B. And
have you tried not being poor?
Have you tried not being poor? Have you tried not being an addict? Just use on the weekends.
Just don't be an addict. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for those of us who understand that there is nuance and there is orders of magnitude, levels of detail that go in between those 2 points, this caucus will be that landing site for a lot of people who may not have been involved up until that point, And I know for me personally, and we'll get back because I got couple more questions I want to ask you on it. But for me personally, when I'm in an environment where maybe drinking isn't the center focal point, but it is a large part of the focal point.
Yeah.
As long as I have one other person that's there with me that I know isn't drinking, that I know is doing this thing, I'm okay, because I can kind of gravitate towards that person and not have to worry about, well, am I matching their level of conversation? It's just, there's something to that. And so this caucus will hopefully be that, if nothing else, it'll be that thing. But I wanted to ask you, because you did say that you don't have a whole lot of reservation about going, to bars or places like that. It doesn't bother you. Has that always been the case for you? Or whenever you first started getting more and more clean and weaning yourself off, did you have to separate yourself from some relationships that you had formed up until that point?
Well, so really it was just, there were people that the only thing I had in common with them was drugs. And so once I wasn't doing drugs, there really wasn't a reason to be around them. So it wasn't so much, well, I'm going to stay away from them because then, they'll just get me back into drugs. It was like, I have nothing else in common with this person whatsoever other than drugs. I will say, it's probably a couple different things. So with weed was honestly one of the toughest ones for me. And I would get around people and be like, oh, I can just hang out with them. And now I'm smoking weed with them, right? Like, it just kind of happened. But what was interesting was I kind of reached a point eventually there where I would do it I'd smoke the weed and then I'd be like, I don't really like this. This isn't fun anymore. Now that I had experienced being sober and successful and feeling secure in who I was, and we're well past the point of this was decades after well over a decade after the divorce, and my parents are getting along fine now as friends, and it's all that stuff out of the way. Now it's like, oh wow, I don't really have a compelling reason to keep doing this. I don't like it. It's costing me money, or it's costing me time. It certainly isn't helping me with any of my goals. And so I'm not going to do it anymore. And I want to put a big caveat there, because so there are a lot of people that they're dealing with chronic pain issues, and they're smoking weed, or they're vaping or taking edibles or whatever, and it helps with their chronic pain issues. Or there are people that that are able to do it recreationally here and there and have fun with it. That's fantastic. Like I personally am not someone who can just do something recreationally. And that's in general. I have an addictive personality. A few years ago, I thought I might get into politics and kind of, get more involved in that. Now look, so I dive into everything that I do, and whether it's good or bad. And drugs was no exception to that. But I eventually reached a point where I was like, I don't really want to do this. And then it became, do I enjoy being around this person? In which case I would remain friends with them and just not smoke, or do I only hang around this person because of weed or because of drugs? And in which case I just stopped doing it. I had an interesting thing that happened with alcohol. So I convinced myself, not sure why, because I knew alcohol was actually worse than weed. But I was like, well, and honestly, probably because it's legal and therefore more socially acceptable in the South. I live in South Carolina. I was like, well, you know what? I could maybe do these like wine tasting groups. And so I joined a wine tasting group. This was in 2006. I joined a wine tasting group, and it started where, if anyone who's been to a wine tasting group, you got kind of two sets of people in there. The ones that are sipping little bits of the wine and, writing down the notes and stuff. And the ones that go there and they're just drinking a lot and getting drunk, and that's what they're doing. I started as that former. I was just, I was taking notes. I'm like, oh, well, that's really cool. And I'm starting to smell all the different things in the wine and all this stuff. And then one day Riesling was my favorite type of wine. And I was doing work one night, and I was staying up kind of late because I had a bunch of work to do. And I thought, I think I'll crack open a Riesling. And enjoy that while I'm doing this. And I did, and I had a glass, and I said, I think I'll have another glass. I go up, and I just saw that I had polished off both bottles that I had, and didn't even realize it. I was pretty sure I had a couple of glasses, but I did not realize. And again, and again, I wasn't blackout drunk or anything like that. I certainly had no business driving or anything, but I was still, could have had an intelligent conversation with you, and was fully aware of what was going on, and still have memories of that evening. In fact, very much so. And I thought, oh, this is going to be like that too. So then I stopped drinking. I think I went to one or two other wine tasting things after that, and one time didn't do anything, and the other time sipped a little bit more, and then I thought, you know what? I think I can see where this is going to go. And then a few years later, I actually back in, I think 2010, 2011, a few years later, I got really sick, and they gave me cough syrup. They prescribed me cough syrup, and I wasn't really thinking. I'm like, oh yeah, cough syrup, that'll help me. I wasn't thinking, why did it have to be prescribed and not just you go to the store and buy it? Well, it turns out it's because it's freaking narcotics. And so it was hydrocodone syrup. And I, again, was not paying attention. I filled out the script. I got it. And I also, part of the reason I wasn't paying attention, I felt like garbage. I had terrible upper respiratory infection. I was coughing terribly. I was in excruciating pain every time I sneezed or coughed, which was often. And I took this stuff, and the pain didn't really go away, but I also didn't care anymore. And then I thought, and I remember, I'm like, man, I feel great. And I went over to the bottle, and I'm like, oh, damn it. And I realized what it was. And so I told myself, I'm only going to use this bottle because I really, really need it, because I'm not feeling well, right? And so I took it, and I stopped. It did make the inflammation go down because I wasn't as irritated and all of that. And also I was extremely, I was feeling good for 4 days or 3 days or whatever it was. It was a small bottle. When that bottle was over, I was sad. And I thought, wow, man, am I glad I don't do drugs. That was a thought I had in that moment. I'm like, man, am I glad I'm away from this kind of stuff. But I was still sad. And I was aware of everything I was experiencing in that moment and why I was experiencing it. And it was a really, that was a very, and some would say I had a relapse there. I don't say I had a, if that was a relapse, if that was a relapse, I've been sober for 9 years, or I guess 10 years now, but whether it was or not, I did it for an actual intention of trying to get better from feeling sick. But that experience when it was over of going, oh man, wow, I wish I had some more. I wish I had a little bit more in that bottle. And I realized, I'm like, wow, I am so glad I haven't spent the past, at that point, 5 years continuing to live like this. And it was a real, it was really a confirmation that I had really done the right thing, and how ruinous it would have been if I had continued that.
Yeah. And that's kind of that's the thing that we all have in common, right? I mean, we've all got our greatest hits when people ask you, oh, what was your drug of choice? But when we boil it down, it's just more. It doesn't matter what, just more, and once that bottle was gone, what a moment of clarity. I get it. And whoever told you that was a relapse, what? Come on, man.
Well, come on. I've had people say it, and then also, and this is where it gets really bad. And I hate to say this. I think 2 or 3 years ago now, on Christmas, I walked by and there's eggnog, and I'm smelling the eggnog, and I thought, I wonder if this is as disgusting as I remember. And so I grabbed a tablespoon and took out a little bit, and I sipped, I think, half of it. And I'm like, oh, yep, no, that's as disgusting as I remember. And and I didn't want to drink anymore, and I haven't had anything since then. I certainly wasn't drunk. I had probably a third of a tablespoon. But I've had people tell me that was a relapse, that I had chosen to go back to alcohol. And I'm like, well, I guess in the strictest of terms, sure. But honestly, and this is part of I think the maturity of the particular journey I'm on. I'm not married to the number. Right. I am proud to say that I have been intentionally sober and not been doing recreational hard drugs or addiction to hard drugs for 15 years. And if someone says, well, technically you did get high during the time that you were, taking that stuff you were prescribed, you could have chosen to just take over the counter stuff instead. And they're right that I could have chosen to take it. I did take it for a reason, and it did actually do that thing. And I certainly was experiencing at least a mild withdrawal after getting off of it. So fine, okay, great. If we're using that definition, then I've only truly been sober for 10 consecutive years. Or if someone says, no, you know what, you took a sip of alcohol, you knew it was alcohol, and you still did it, you damn dirty drinker, you are now only sober for 3 years. I'll accept that. And this, by the way, is a message to people who have been struggling and who have remained sober for quite a period of time and do occasionally have times that they fall off the wagon. Yeah, you have still done so much during that time for your health and for your well-being. And I certainly don't encourage anyone to fall off the wagon. I am saying that if you do, it does not negate what you have done up until that point. It's just a reminder of why you were doing it, and you get right back on it. And if that takes away your precious number that someone wants to take away from you, then so be it. If my 15 is really only 11 or 10 or really only 3, then so be it. Although I will fight people on the eggnog thing because I didn't feel that. But I mean, that's probably not much different than if I, accidentally swallowed the mouthwash or something like that. But I mean, but if it's only a 10 instead of 15, okay, great. It's only 10 instead of 15. I'm glad for the choices that I have made, and I'm happy and proud of myself for doing it. And that's a message to everyone here. Whether you unintentionally or intentionally fell off the wagon, it does not negate what you've done up to that point. It does not mean you have to go back. You do not have to shame spiral into going back into addiction. You just simply say, hey, this was confirmation that I am glad that I'm choosing to remain sober, and I'm going to go back to remaining sober.
That I am so glad that we have stumbled upon this part of the conversation. I didn't know that this would be coming up, but it's so important to drive home a certain part. People who get involved themselves in recovery come in thinking that everybody's healed and everybody's perfect, not realizing that they're sitting in an ER waiting room. Okay. So like, you got to know that like a lot of these people that are coming in, that none of us are got clean because we were like, oh, everything's great. No, we got clean because we had some other shit going on.
Exactly.
And so sometimes, even with the best of intentions, sometimes we come across a little abrasive. And so
well, it's an attempt at accountability, and I get it. I get that desire to be like, no, you have to stay sober. No, you can't say that you've been sober if this happened or that happened. And you know what? I even respect what they're saying, because they're worried that if we dilute the concept of sober down until eventually doesn't mean anything, then we can all delude ourselves and all fool ourselves into thinking that we're sober when we're not. And I get that. I get why they're doing that, and I even respect it, which is why I don't even fight it. Like I said, I'll fight the eggnog thing because that was stupid. But the thing with the cough syrup, you know what? That's a compelling point. I make the distinction that I was actually using a drug that I was prescribed for a specific purpose and only did it for that purpose, and then stopped once there wasn't any left. But the reality is I could have chosen another way of doing that. And moving forward from there, I have been more explicit, because I don't talk about it a lot, man, but I do deal with pain with DMS. And I do, for those who don't know, I have multiple sclerosis, and I do deal with some pain and some spasms and things like that. And, I go to the doctor and they'll tell me these different types of pain-related medications and treatments and therapies that I can take. And I say, listen, I'm not interested in that. CBD or something like that, that's one thing. But anything that's going to be psychoactive, I'd rather stay away from it. I'd rather look for, so I do a lot of like physical therapy, when often they're telling me, hey, you know what? There are some narcotics that can help with nerve pain, or some people have found that THC really helps with this. And I say, hey, you know what? I know who I am and what my triggers are, and so if I'm going to have to experience a little bit extra pain, and I'm going to have to do more physical therapy to stay nice and limber and in as little pain as possible without that stuff, then I choose to do that, precisely because I don't want to make excuses and say, oh well, this is just for my pain. So I get why they do it, but I also think we need to show some grace to people. And I think more importantly than that, we need to show grace to ourselves, man. I've met people that beat themselves up so hard because they've been sober for, however many months or years, and then they fall off the wagon for a really bad week or a really bad weekend, and they beat themselves up and they go, man, I'm just a dirty addict. And it's like, no, you're a person who made a mistake, and here you are sober again, and that's okay. What a great confirmation that that you've been doing the right thing, and that you can't just drink occasionally or just do drugs occasionally or whatever. What a good teaching moment. But you're not. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you. It's why we say we're recovering. It's why we say we're in recovery. We're not healed. We're recovering.
Yeah, I struggle with that myself, and I had 7.5 years and fell off for 4 months. And I mean, I didn't fall off pretty. It was bad, real bad.
Of course, yeah.
I got to make it grand. Got to make a spectacle out of it, man.
Right. If you're going to do it, then in for a penny. Yeah.
But even so, like I've got well over a year now, and everything's going great. But I was on Joshua Smith's podcast, and he asked the question, "How long have you been clean?" And it's still a gut shot. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to pick yourself back up, especially after having time. But on the point, like, we're going to have surgeries. We're going to have moments in our life where, man, sometimes that Tylenol isn't going to cut it. And for me, like my sponsor, and not everybody does the 12-step thing, but I look to my sponsor for some wisdom. And he said, take it as prescribed. And whenever you find yourself obsessing about your next time that you can use it, your next dosage, try Tylenol instead. And if you can wean yourself off that way, go for it. And that's kind of that dividing point, man. Yeah. If we relapse, we don't have to sit there and ask, did I just relapse? You will know if you relapse. You will know if you cross that line. Yeah. There will be no bones about it. But
and if it happens, it's a confirmation that you have been doing the right thing by not doing that. So just go back to not doing it. I think a lot of times people, when they fall off, they do so hard is they're like, well, I already screwed up, so I might as well just go. It's like, no. That's a shame spiral thing. I'm a bad person, so this is who I am, and I'll just accept it. No, you made a mistake, and you don't have to keep making it. And what an amazing confirmation that you've been doing the right thing up until now, that how upset you are by doing this and how bad you feel about it and how crappy it's making you feel. Great. So then go back to not doing it. And it's going to be very difficult, and you may have withdrawals and everything else, but you know what that's like. You've already been through it. You know that you can get past it. You know that you're stronger from it when you get away from it. So we get back on that. And that's where being there for each other comes back in, because it's easy to tell someone that. It's another thing to be there for them when they're having, withdrawals or having that emotional withdrawal. And a lot of times it's especially with weed, and some of these things that don't have as much of the chemical withdrawal, but there's an emotional withdrawal from it. And we're there for each other and through that. That's a really incredible thing. And it can make that scaling back, that stepping back from the ledge of addiction to, it can make it be a lot easier and pass by a lot more quickly.
It never ceases to amaze me how no matter what route somebody took, no matter their background, no matter what, but anybody who has been stuck in addiction and gotten out, got it clean, we all have picked up certain tenets, regardless of the avenue that we took to get there. And one of the main things is like a profound sense of understanding for other people who've been there. That doesn't ever really go away, for a lot of us. And I just got to thank you so much for showing up and coming on the podcast, because we've really gotten into some areas of this deal that I didn't think we'd get into. But, man, I'm really glad that we got into it,
I am too, man. I am too.
Let me ask you, and this is one question I always ask anybody who tells their story. If you could talk to that one person in the audience right now who has been struggling with addiction, they haven't quite got to that jumping off point, but they're almost there, what can you say to that person?
I think the thing that I would say is this: whatever reasons you're considering not doing it. Now, some of it's probably, I'm worried it's going to be uncomfortable. I'm worried I may lose people, in my life that I think right now are important. I'm worried about the reasons that I am masking these problems with addiction. I'm worried that those problems are now going to surface. I'm going to have to deal with them. Whatever those reasons are, there may be something in the back of your head saying, I don't know if I really need to even do this, if I even really have a problem. That's usually just the denial, but sometimes it's a legitimate, like, hey, do I have a problem, or am I just doing this casually or recreationally, and people are overreacting. What I'm going to tell you is this: if your use of something or your action in any way has reached a point where you and others around you are talking about you're not doing it or you're stopping doing it, then I would almost certainly tell you that you don't have to ask that question of yourself. You don't have to ask if it's the right idea for you to go sober. And the other thing I'll say is that if there's any doubt, just go ahead and try doing it. Get sober, and you're going to go through the whatever withdrawals, either actual physical withdrawals or just emotional withdrawals, or the trauma resurfacing or whatever that comes from that. And all of that stuff, by the way, is confirmation that you're doing the right thing, because that is your body actually healing and recovering, beginning the process of healing and recovering from what you've been putting it through. But you know what? Go ahead and do it, and get to the point where you're actually sober, you're not experiencing that stuff anymore, and start going through the process of doing the work. And I would advise you to, I'd encourage you to see a therapist and to do the whole thing, and to find accountability partners and to find sober friends and all of that. Do the whole thing, do what it takes to do that. And if at some point you say to yourself, you know what, this sobriety thing isn't for me, my head being clearer and my skin clearing up and my my probably losing weight and all the things that are coming from this isn't for me, I'm going to go back to drug addiction. You always have the choice to do that. I'm not going to make you remain sober. Try as the state might to keep you sober. We all know how unsuccessful that is. You can always go back to doing drugs if you decide that that's so much better than a life of clarity and sobriety. So I would say, take the leap. Let's try to do it, and find people that are going to help you through this. And then I guess the final thing that I would say is that, and this is something that I say just in general often to people, whatever you may think of yourself, you are here for a reason. You have a unique spirit that no one else has, will have, or ever has had. There is no one who has ever been you, and no one that is you, and no one that ever will be you but you. Whatever faith or lack thereof that you have, you are clearly here for some kind of reason. I personally believe that reason is to do as much good on this earth as we can do. I believe that while we are here, to whatever extent we can help those around us, that we can do so. And I think that you're coming to terms with this thing and defeating it and coming clear and becoming sober from it is that first step to being able to do so much more than you're even doing now. And whatever choice that you take, you are still a unique and valid person. I still care about you. I'm still grateful that you're here. And I hope that you find happiness and fulfillment in whatever it is that you do.
Beautifully said, Spike. Beautifully said. Man, you hit the nail on the head with that. I love that. All right. Well, there you go, man. Spike, thank you so much for sitting down with us and talking and getting your story out there. I just know somebody's going to hear it. And like on your latter point, man, I firmly believe that we as addicts all have one particular key that fits somebody else's particular prison cell in their mind.
Right.
Our story is powerful. Each and every one of us is very unique and has our own bit of funk we can bring to the conversation. You know what I'm saying? And I'm really stoked to get yours out there, man. Is there anything you want to plug before we wrap this up?
I guess just follow my social media. I am Spike Cohen on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram. I am on TikTok, but I haven't done anything in like a year on TikTok. I even have a team who's trying to help me do TikTok. But I'm such a boomer when it comes to TikTok. I don't even get the humor that's on. I don't get what's happening on there. I don't understand it. But I am on TikTok technically. I just opened up a Clubhouse account. I don't even know what to call it. I don't know how Clubhouse works. I hope to be using Clubhouse. I don't know what I'm even doing. So you may or may not see or hear me or whatever. I don't even know what to tell you to do with me on Clubhouse, but I have a whatever you have on Clubhouse and may or may not be using it at some point in the near or later future. So check me out or not on Clubhouse. I don't know. Also, if you want to check out the shows that I do every week on Muddied Waters Media, Muddied Waters Media is on all social media and podcasting applications. We'll probably now be on Clubhouse as well. Again, I don't know what Clubhouse is, but we're on it.
We're there.
Yeah, Muddied Waters Media is where I do my shows, and Spike Cohen is where I do everything else. So I am doing events across the country. I'm going to be in California, in Fresno, this coming weekend for their Libertarian Party convention for 2021. The following week, I'm going to be in Golden, Colorado, just outside of Denver. The following week, I'm going to be in Dover, Delaware. I'm going all across the country. So if you go to spikecohen.com, that has a few different things on there. Some of my newest media appearances, some of my newest, my upcoming events. But one of the things that you can find on there are the upcoming things that I'm going to be doing. And if I'm going to be anywhere near you, plan to come out. Come and meet me. I'd love to meet you and hang out. Everywhere I go, I do Q&A sessions. I try to answer as many questions as I can. So come out. You got that burning question that you always wanted to ask one of those smug libertarians. If you want to come out and share your sobriety story or what you're going through, I'm happy to hear it. Come out and hang out with me. I'd love to get to meet you guys in person. And Drew, again, thank you so much for having me on, man. I love you, and I'm so happy and grateful for what it is you're doing to help people inside and outside of this movement to be able to remain sober and build that camaraderie with other people who are in the same struggle.
Yeah, I love you too, bro. We all bring to the table what we can. You know, you're doing what you're doing. I'm doing what I'm doing. And together we make a community that's changing the world a little bit at a time. So,
I love it, man.
Yeah, anytime you want to come on, you always have an open invitation to the Clean Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you, man. That means a lot to me. Absolutely.
All right, buddy. You have a good one.
Thank you.
And there you have it, guys. That was Spike Cohen. I enjoy every single story of recovery. I do. I especially enjoy every single person that takes the time out of their day to show up on this podcast and, record their story for others to hear. And Spike is no exception. It's just awesome hearing. It's really, for me, I think it's important for me to understand and grasp the fact that, people find recovery in their own ways. People find their own journey, and it's okay. Spike's story is nowhere near mine. There's similarities, but there's also some major differences. But those major differences are exactly what is going to pique the curiosity of somebody else. And that's kind of something that him and I both talked about, after we ended the phone call there, is that, there's been some people who've heard his story before and they didn't think they were an addict before, but they kind of heard some similarities in there. And so if nothing else, maybe not the end result, but if nothing else, if you're struggling, if you're going through a spot right now, look back through my podcast interviews. There's been several stories of recovery, and find the similarities instead of the differences. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, obviously if you're listening to this podcast, you know where to find the podcast, but find me and send a message. I'd be more than happy to talk to you. We can figure this thing out, but you are worth it. You are worth it, and you have a future ahead of you. So with that being said, thank you so much again to Spike one more time for coming on, and we'll just segue into the song of the day. And I think I've done this song before. This is a Fugazi cover by Jesse Stewart, and I don't know, man, I enjoy this song. It's Fugazi's I'm So Tired, but Jesse Stewart did a cover of it, and it's really good. So anyway, I hope you enjoy that. I hope you have a fantastic week. Thank you for hanging tough, and I apologize once again that this episode got out a little late. But with that, we'll wrap it up with Jesse Stewart's I Am So Tired.
Separate from you all. everything I learned, I hid my tracks and I spit out all my air. I slipped into cracks, stripped of all my cares, all my cares, all my cares. I'm so tired